cancer in his back, in his spine, in his liver, in his kidneys, in his the lymph nodes in your neck. He had cancer all through it, basically all through his body. That was Larry in Indiana. So he just died of cancer. Our mom, she died of cancer. Of course, she had been a chain, well, not a chain smoker, but she had smoked. She was 82 when she passed away, and she had smoked ever since she was, a teenager. So when they first found the cancer, it scared her, and she quit smoking. She just quit, completely quit, just like that. But then she had in her belly area, she had what they call an aortic aneurysm, and it was something that they periodically, would do like an ultrasound just to see if it had grown any. And that's when they found the spot on her left lung when they were, moving the thing around, scanning the aortic aneurysm. And of course, they found the spot, so they didn't know what it was until what the doctor did is he took a needle and poked it into her and went into where the spot was at, with what they call a biopsy. So he withdrew, liquid off of the spot, and then the results came back that it was cancer. And so when mom found that out, it scared her. But then after a couple of weeks, then she decided to start smoking again. She figured, well, either the cancer's going to take me or the aortic aneurysm that she's got is going to take her. So one or the other, you know, will, end her life. She didn't know which one would, happen, end her life first, but she figured, I'm not, I'm 80 some years old, I'm 80 years old now, and I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to give up, smoking because I got cancer. So the cancer is actually what took her life because eventually it spread and it spread into her brain and it just she didn't know anybody. She didn't know anybody. Couldn't talk to anybody. She just she just when it was when her hospice nurse I called her. I called her a hospice nurse and told her, what was going on with mom. She says, well, I was just there yesterday and me and your mom were just, having a regular conversations like we are right now, just talking about everything. I said, well, that ain't what the way she is today. Because when I went up to her apartment and stuff, because I at the time I was living in the same building she was living in. I was on the sixth floor and she lived on the seventh floor, and so she wouldn't even leave her apartment and stuff. I mean, I had a key to her, the apartment building. It was a 14 floor high rise, and it was a senior place, and so she gave me the key to her mailbox because downstairs on the first floor they had like mailboxes for every single apartment, and so when I would go down and check my mail, I would also check her mail, and then I would take her mail up to her, and I took the mail up to her one day, and I knocked on her door, didn't, no answer. So after about a minute, I knocked on the door again, and she says, "Yep, I'm coming." So when she unlocked the door so I could go in, I could barely get in because she had a walker that was sitting next to her chair, so she could use that to to move around to go to the into the CR or into the kitchen, or whatever and stuff. And but when she unlocked the door, I could barely get in. She didn't use her walker to come over and unlock the door. She she took an she had a table, you know, that had three chairs around it, that were on, like, wheels and stuff. Well, she got up out of her chair, walked over to the table, grabbed a hold of the back of one of her chairs, and rolled it over to unlock the door instead of using her walker. So when I finally got in, I got her into the kitchen. I put the chair back where it was supposed to go, and then I got her walker and brought it over to her, and then, walked her over so she could sit down in her chair. And the whole time, she never said a word to me. Never said a word. And I said, Mom, are you okay? She didn't hear me. I said, Mom, you okay? Well, when I yelled Mom louder, she it startled her, and because she had been sitting in her chair with her head just hanging down. Eyes weren't closed or nothing. She was just, her head was just hanging down. And when I yelled Mom louder, her head jerked up and she looked at me. And her head went back down. And so I didn't know what was going on with her. So that's what I called her hospice nurse, because I had her phone number in my phone. And I told her what was going on with Mom. And she says, well, I was just there yesterday and we were carrying on a conversation. I said, well, she's not saying a word. And she looks at me and doesn't acknowledge me or talk to me or nothing. So she says, well, I'll be right over. So she came over, and she saw what was going on when she buzzed. I let her in and stuff downstairs on the first floor, and and she came up to Mom's apartment, and she sat down where I had been sitting at, and I just moved to a different chair, and I told her, I said, this is the way she was when and I told her about when I had showed up with her mail and stuff, that I couldn't get in the door, and that so she sat down, and where Mom's name was Alice Jean, but she just went by Jean. Everybody knew her by Jean, by her middle name. So she says, Jean. Mom didn't acknowledge her or nothing. And so she said it a little bit louder. She said, Jean. And then Mom's head jerked up and looked at her, but didn't say a word. Just head dropped back down. And so she says, well, it seems like the cancer has spread to her brain, and she's not comprehending, who anybody is. She just reacts to a loud noise. So she says, well, I want to make arrangements for her to be transferred to this place where she eventually passed away. It was called Cairo Dwelling, and it was run by hospice. And there was only 4 beds in the house, and a nurse was there, 24/7. When one nurse, when her shift was up, there was another nurse that showed up to take over and stuff. So there was a nurse there all the time. And so she she had her hospice nurse says, well, can you stay with your mom tonight until until the ambulance comes to you know transfer transport her to this Cairo dwelling place. And I said, yeah. I said, I'll just have to let somebody from the office know that I'm would be staying with my mom that night and stuff. And so I spent the night there. I just you know the chair that I was sitting in and stuff. It was a recliner like this and stuff. And so I just slept in the chair, and mom just slept on. She had it was a couch, but it could be converted into a bed. You could raise the seat up and click it, and then it would, the back would drop down, so it made it like into a bed. But mom just slept on it as a couch. That way, she liked to have her back up against a solid object and stuff. So mom would just sleep on the couch all the time. She had a bed and stuff, but she never slept in the bed. So I I stayed there, and then I called Lisa and Larry down in Indiana and let them know what was going on. So they came up, and then they followed us out to this Cairo dwelling and stuff. And that mom was put in there and stuff, and she was there for well, it was 10 days before she passed away. Then, but when she was there, she knew everybody. I mean, like I was there, Lisa and Larry were there, uh, other family members that she had up there and stuff. That was like her late husband. It was his family, but it was she considered it part of her family too. And they were there. They came out, with visiting with her and stuff. And I said, Mom, do you know where you're at? She says, oh, yeah. I said, do you know everybody that's here? She says, yeah, I know everybody. And she was naming off everybody. So she, for whatever reason, she seemed perfectly fine. But they only put them in that place when they're in their last days before they pass away. And so, yeah, she lasted 10 days before she passed away. And I went up. It was a Sunday, and I went there at like 8 o'clock in the morning, and I walked in, and then the nurse is sitting there at the kitchen table, just doing paperwork or whatever and stuff, and I walked over into Mom's room, and the smell was terrible. I went back out and I told the nurse, I says, well, it smells like Mom, you know, you know, dirty her diaper or whatever. Cause they had her in a diaper because, you know, it got to the point where they wouldn't even get her up and take her to the bathroom. They just put a diaper on her and stuff, and then they would periodically change the diaper. And but she says, well, I was just in there like, not even an hour ago, and and changed her and cleaned her up, took like, wet, wipe downs or whatever, and wiped her down and everything, and put a clean, it's an adult diaper, but I put it on her. She says, well, I just, cleaned her all up and everything, and put a clean, diaper on and everything. I says, well, I don't know what's going on, but she says, I said, it stinks in her room right now, big time. So she says, well, you just go out and have a seat in the living room and stuff, because it was like a little living room, had a couple of chairs and a small little couch and stuff. And she says, and I'll, get her all cleaned up and everything, and then you can go back in, and stuff. Well, she was in there maybe a minute at the most. It might even been less than that. And she came back out and she says, Well, unfortunately, your mom has passed, and that's what happened. Is when her body passed, when she passed away, her bowels let loose, and then everything came out, and that's what I was smelling was because her bowels just let go, and everything she had inside of her came out, and so that's what had happened. Is that she just passed away, and that's what was that's why the smell was in her room. So I, she says, well, I'm a nurse, but we still have to have a doctor come and get the official, that he has to officially, list her as deceased, and the time and everything. They have to make it official by a doctor, even though she's a certified nurse. A doctor still has to, certify that she passed away. So and of course Lisa and Larry had already, you know, they stayed at mom's, where mom lived. They stayed there for, 3 or 4 days while mom was in the Cairo dwelling place. And of course then they, went back to Indiana. And then of course after mom passed, then of course I had to call them and let them know that she had just passed away. So they, made a trip back up to, to Michigan, and where they lived in Rochester, Indiana, and it was like less than a 2-hour drive from where they lived to, where she lived at and stuff. So they drove back up there, and and it was there, after she had passed away and stuff, and and then and mom had already taken care of everything, as far as the funeral and everything. She had that prearranged because she had paid for it ahead of time and everything, and had the money in what they call an escrow account. So it was all paid for and everything. So nothing had to be done about with that or anything like that. So that was all prearranged. So so huh? What was my mom's job? Well, the last job she actually had was when she lived here in Ohio. She lived in Dayton, Ohio. That was way back when I got out of boot camp back in '75, because I went in June 25th of '75. I graduated June 1st, and 25 days later, I was in boot camp because I had tried to find a job. I was living with her in Dayton, Ohio. She was working at a place called Dayton Economy Drugs, and she didn't work somewhere that manufactured the drug, but they would get the you know the pills or whatever in capsules, whatever, and then they were responsible for packaging them all up and everything to be shipped out to wherever they went, whether they'd gone to doctors or pharmacies or wherever and stuff. You know, they came in to her where she worked at already in the bottle, with all sealed up and everything, and then they just had to package them as to where they were going to be shipped out to. And so she worked there for quite a few years, and that was the last paying job that she had. And that was back in the mid '70s, and that's why when I got out of Mohegan Youth Camp down south of Worcester here, they had to find somewhere to put me because I was ready to be released but they weren't going to put me back with my mom because I wasn't 18 yet. And so they decided, well, no, they're not going to put me back with my mom because they don't want to take a chance of her abandoning me again, and I wasn't 18 yet. So that's when they found the children's home, up north of Worcester here, the Christian Children's Home of Ohio. And so that's where I went in August of '71 when I got released from Mohegan Youth Camp. And I was there until I went there in August of '71, and I left there. I graduated June 1st of '75, so I was there like 2 months shy of 4 years. I was there. I was there for 3 years and 10 months. That's how long I lived at the children's home. And so I graduated. Oh, something something went off as my other phone here. Oh, 50% off of whatever about my camera and stuff. It said 50% off for whatever reason. I just ignore the stuff. I just delete it. But no, when I graduated June 1st in 1975, and I went back down where my mom lived in Dayton, Ohio, and I lived there, and I was out every day trying to find a job. I was out every day putting applications in. I did it for like 2 weeks straight and couldn't find a job. So mom came home one day from work and she says, "Well, unfortunately, you're going to need to find somewhere else to live because what I make is not enough to pay my rent and my utilities and to buy you food and me food. So you're going to have to find somewhere else to live." So that's when I went down to Trotwood, Ohio, which is like a suburb of Dayton, and signed up for the Navy. So I graduated June 1st of '75, and June 25th I was in boot camp. 25 days after I graduated, I was in boot camp of the Navy. So my grandmother, she passed away it was in 1995. It was my mom's mom, my, grandma, it was Grandma Curry. It was Grandma and Grandpa, Harold and Belma Curry. And she passed away in 1995. And she had went in to the hospital sometime before she passed away, and she was having problems with her legs. Her legs, yeah, her legs and her feet were like they were cold. Just they were cold all the time. When you touch them, it was just like she had been outside in 0-degree weather, winter and stuff, and they were just cold all the time. So she had went in to the hospital, and what they did is they cleaned out the veins on one side, on one of her legs, and and got the circulation, working on that leg. And then, once she recovered from that and was, healed and everything, then she was going to go back into the hospital and have the other leg, the veins, arteries or whatever it was, cleaned out so that she would get the blood circulation through that one. Well, when she went in, when the doctor cut into her and stuff, to clean out her veins and stuff, when they cut into her body, it put off a very, very horrible smell. And what had happened is inside of her body, um, she had some kind of problems. And when they cut into her upper, leg to, go in and clean out her veins on her second leg, something inside of her body had started, just, you know, deteriorating, whatever and stuff. It just, when they opened her leg up and stuff, it just all this smell come out, and she never recovered from it. So, because when she passed away in the hospital, I was there, Mom was there, and Larry that lived in Springfield, he was there. So we were all three in the hospital when she took her last breath. Because Mom was sitting in a chair beside the bed, and Larry and I were standing at the foot of the bed and stuff. And she was doing the same thing that Mom was doing when when the cancer spread to her brain. Grandma would just, Mom would say something loud to her, and her eyes would like open up, and she would just stare. And then her eyes would go, like closed again and stuff. And each time Mom would say her name loud, or just say Mom, loud, Grandma's eyes would open up, because it was a noise and it startled her and stuff, even though she couldn't talk to us or nothing. And excuse me, and she just, her breathing was getting, her breaths were getting smaller and smaller until finally she took one deep breath, let it out, and she just stopped breathing in. So we told the nurse to come in right away and stuff, and she took her stethoscope thing, she checked for a pulse and in the neck and on the arm, and she was, had her stethoscope and was listening at her heart, no heartbeat or nothing. And so so they had to get a doctor to come in and, officially pronounce her, deceased. And even though we were right in the hospital stuff, it still required that a doctor, you know, official makes it official and says, okay, the time of death is so, such and such a time and stuff. And then after the funeral and everything like that was all over with, and Grandma was, buried out where Grandpa was buried at and stuff. Then Mom she wanted to get away, so she went. That's when she went up to Michigan, up to where she lived, and stuff up around the Kalamazoo area and stuff. And I was living, the house, that it was Mom, me, Mom, and Grandma all lived there and stuff in the same house. And because I had a bedroom, Grandma slept on the couch out in the living room, and Mom slept in the bed where that was Grandma's bedroom and stuff. And then Mom decided, after the funeral and everything was over, that she just wanted to get away for a while, and so she went back to Michigan and stuff, and she was going to stay with a friend of hers. Name was Barb, and so she stayed with her and stuff, and then the guy that she was married to, Harry, they had lived together in Michigan for 6 years, but they had never gotten married. They were, they lived together, but no, they did get married. Yeah, they did get married, and because me and a cousin of the family that lived in Xenia, where my sister lives at now, Bob LaValle was his name. Me and him went up to Michigan for Mom and Harry's, wedding and stuff. And but we And so when they had they had well they lived together in a house for 6 years. What's going on with your camera? Something flashed on it and stuff. It froze and then something flashed on the center and then it disappeared. Oh, oh, and so they lived. Mom and Harry lived together in a house up here in Comstock, Michigan, which is just outside of Kalamazoo, and they lived there in the same house for 6 years. But they were never married when they were there. Well, Harry was working, and mom wasn't working at that time and stuff. But Harry came home from work one day, and he just, he didn't yell at mom or anything. He just, when he came home one day, he just says, "Well, I think we're going to need to, go our separate ways because," he says, "I don't love you, and I don't think I ever did love you," even though they lived together in the same house for 6 years, and the house was in both of their names. So when, um, so she moved out, and that's when she moved back down to Springfield and was living with his grandma and stuff. And he stayed in Michigan. But then when they sold the house, she had to make a trip back up to Michigan to sell the house because the house was in both of their names. So he couldn't sell it unless she signed also. So she had to go back to Michigan so they could both sign the papers to sell the house. And so I went with her. I rode with her and stuff when we went up to Michigan and stuff. And but then after Grandma passed away in '93, after when she said she wanted to get away for a while, and then she went back to Michigan to stay with her friend Barb. Well, she went to the VFW up there in Comstock, Michigan, that her and Harry used to go to all the time. The VFW is Veterans of Foreign Wars. It's an organization for veterans and stuff because he was in the Korean War and stuff. And so she went there and stuff, just to hang out and stuff. And then Harry showed up one day, and they sat around and was talking and stuff. And he says, "Well, it was pointed out to me by many people, especially my family. My sons and my daughters, and my son's wives. Everybody that knew us, they made it very clear to him that he had made one of the worst mistakes of his life when him and her, you know, split up and went their separate ways. That it was the worst mistake he had ever made." And he said, "Yeah, I realized that after the fact, and stuff." And so they wound up getting married. And he, but she made it very clear to him if they were going to get married, he had to sell out of where he was living in Michigan and move to Springfield. She wasn't going to move back up to Michigan. He had to move down to Springfield, Ohio. He said, "Okay, not a problem." So he sold the trailer that he was living in and moved back down, to where you know where me and Grandma was living at and stuff. And so him and Mom had a bedroom, and I had a bedroom. And I was working at the time because I was working at Long John Silver's in Springfield, Ohio. And so But me and Harry, we remodeled that whole house. We put all new vinyl siding on the outside of the house. We we installed a bathroom because she didn't have a bathroom. She had an outhouse, and so she had never had a bathroom. So when he moved down, we put all new vinyl siding on the house, built a brand new porch on the front of the house, um, had a two-car garage built, and and between Harry and I, we drywalled all of the garage, and then I got up above the ceiling, and he was down below, and we put blown insulation in the attic of the garage, and I'm up there, I got this, mask on and stuff, and I'm up there. It's hotter than dickens up there. I'm sweating, and I got this hose, blowing the blown insulation around everywhere, fill everything in, and I'm sweating, and this insulation as it's flying through the air is just caking me, and I come down and I look like a gray snowman because it was like blown insulation, and because of the sweat, it was just sticking to me. So I looked like a gray snowman. And the same thing happened in the house. We we redid the whole inside of the house. We drywalled it, and I got up in the attic, and he was downstairs, and I was up there putting blown insulation in above the ceilings in the house also, and same thing there. It's hotter than heck up there, and I sweating like crazy, and all this insulation as it's flying through the ears and stuff, it's sticking to me, and oh yeah, it was a lot of fun. But but that house ain't even there anymore. For mom, um, they had for I don't know, somehow or other he convinced her to sell out and move back up to Michigan because his sons and daughters and nieces and nephews and everybody was in Michigan. Mom had nobody in Springfield other than me, and because all the relatives that she had was from her mom's side of the family, so they weren't blood relatives of mom's. So, so he convinced her to move back to Michigan. So they sold it. She sold it on a land contract to somebody. So she had taken out a loan at a bank. So when she sold the property, the house and everything to somebody, to a couple on land contract, what they were doing is each month they were paying her money, and so the money she was getting in each month from the new people that owned the house now would pay for the loan that she had at the bank and stuff. So it more than covered it. She even had a little bit extra left, after making the monthly payment to the bank, my mom. And but yeah, Ken and I showed up down there one time, um, and you couldn't even see the house in the garage. I mean, the house, and the driveway going up to the garage, everything was just, it had like 20-foot weeds growing everywhere. You you could see the roof of the house above the weeds, but you could not see the house. I mean, the people that lived there, I don't know what happened. I don't know whether they just upped and left. I mean, they had paid mom everything that they owed her on it, but then I don't know whether they just decided not to sell it and they moved out or what. I have no idea what happened. But then, yeah, me and Ken saw it one time, and it was just, you couldn't even see the house or the garage. The weeds were so high. All you do was see the roof of the house. And then the next time I went down, it was all gone. The house, the garage, and everything was gone. I mean, the county had come in and demolished it and leveled everything out and planted grass and everything as to where it was and stuff. And but yep, it was gone. Ken and I said, "Well, we wish we would have had the money and stuff, and we could have bought it ourselves, and kept it, in the family and stuff. But you know, we didn't know what was going on with it. We tried to find, we had searched online to see, who owned it or what, and when we searched it online, it just says, you know, property unavailable. That's all it said. Didn't say who owned it or nothing. It just said property unavailable. So, and it's just like the address of the home, where we lived at and stuff. Um, the number, like the 4-digit code to like my uh, bank card and stuff, my debit card for my checking account. Um, it's the same numbers that mom used, and what it was the three numbers of the address where we lived, where the house and everything, but with one there was a zero put in front of the other three numbers, and so that's the code I used for my debit card from the bank, and mom used it for her card from her bank when she lived in Michigan. So I just used the same number, so it's easy it's easy to remember it because it was my grandma's address. It just has a zero in front of the other three numbers. So makes it very easy to remember it. My grandfather, well now see grandma and grandma, they were they were actually they weren't married like, where you go in front of a judge or a minister or whatever, where you get married and stuff. They lived together for, I don't know, up teen years. And back then, I mean, they stopped it now, but back then, if you lived together, if a couple lived together 7 years or more, it was called common law marriage. So now you didn't have to, you didn't go in front of a minister or whatever, and get married and all that. But if you wanted to get divorced, you had to file paperwork to get a divorce, even though they didn't do that to get married, because back then, like I said, if it was 7 years or more, it's what they called common law marriage. So, and they lived together for, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 some years. I'm not sure exactly how long it was. Because Grandpa died in he died in 1972. No, 1975. Yeah. Yeah, because I was living at the children's home up here when he passed away. So he died in 75, and then my grandma, she passed away in 93. But that was not mom's dad. So grandma was mom's mom, but her dad was somebody else, not the Harold Curry that grandma and grandma was you know so-called married to. So I have no idea who mom's real dad was. I idea. I don't know. I'm assuming Mom knew, but I never asked her about it or anything. All I know is that Grandpa was not, even though in the blood sense of the word he wasn't my grandpa, but I still called him Grandpa. It was Grandpa and Grandma and Grandpa. So, and they're buried, in this, at the same spot, in a cemetery down there in Springfield, because that's one of the places when I go down there that I always put flowers on their grave. And matter of fact, yeah, I think I even sent you one of the pictures that I sent you, because it says Harold C. and Velma L. And then in the center it says Curry, Curry. And one of Grandma's brothers, him and his wife is buried in the same cemetery that Grandma and Grandpa's in. So I always stop by their grave also and put flowers on their grave. And then, of course, my brother Larry, um, his ashes are in the chapel at the cemetery, same cemetery. So, and then, of course, there's, pardon? My father, he passed away May 22nd, 1980. And actually, I was here in Worcester at the time. But that's when I was in, I don't know if should be saying this while you're recording or not. That's when I was locked up. When he passed away in 1980, I was sitting in here in town in the county, what, waiting to go to court to go to be, to go where I went and stuff. And my sister tracked me down, and Ken, he was in a prison in Ohio, and he was already in prison. So he could, they said that the only way he could go to Dad's viewing or funeral or anything is if nobody else was there, and that was the only way. There wouldn't be, he could go in to the viewing or the funeral, but there couldn't be anybody else around. So he wasn't able to go. Huh? Yeah. So yeah, and I got, so she tracked me down. I was sitting in jail waiting to go to court. I didn't get to court yet. And I was just waiting to go to court when she, talked to me on the phone. And so I told the deputy sheriff about it and everything. And so the guy that was in charge, his name was Captain Rhodes. he he talked to the judge and told the judge, he says, "Oh yeah, if we let him out, to go to his dad's, funeral and everything, he'll come back and turn himself in. I'm not worried about him, taking off or whatever." And I did. And the guy that was the administrator at the children's home, he came and picked me up at 6 o'clock in the morning from the jail and took me to where my car was at. And so I drove down to Xenia, Ohio, and the viewing and the funeral for Dad was the same day. Because most times you got the viewing, and then 2 or 3 days later is the funeral. But Dad was both of it was the same day, the viewing and the funeral. So I was at the viewing, and then I was went to the cemetery afterwards, and then I 10 o'clock at night, I was turning myself back in. So I left at 6 in the morning, went down there, went to the viewing, the funeral and everything, and then turned around, drove back up here to Worcester and turned myself back in. It was 10 o'clock at night when I turned myself back in. And see, they knew I wasn't going to run. So that's why, they told the judge, oh yeah, we're not worried about him running. He'll be back. And I was, I had no reason to run. I was guilty of what I did. And, so, you know, I figured, hey, I messed up. I have to pay the consequences. So, her name was Lucy Nickel, Mickle, Nickel. She's buried down just outside of Columbus, Ohio, which is about, so from here to where the cemetery where she's buried at is about a 2 hour drive. And so I knew where she had passed away at. She was in Yellow Springs, which is where my mom was born at, but she was in a nursing home there in Yellow Springs, and that's where she passed away at. She was actually sitting in the like cafeteria area or whatever, eating, with the other people that lived there and stuff, and she just passed away. She just fell over into her plate of food. She just like that, she was gone. So I knew where they had the viewing at because there was a nursing home right there in Yellow Springs, and it was years after she had passed away. At the time I couldn't remember what year it was that she passed away. It was in 1985 when she passed away, and I knew the funeral home where they had this service at. So I went in there one time. Actually, I'd say that was probably 8, 9 years ago, maybe 10, that I stopped in there and I said, you know, I know her name, Lucy Mickle. It was my great great grandma, but I don't know where she's buried at. Oh, and I can't remember. At the time I couldn't even remember what year she passed away. So I gave the girl, working there at the funeral, and I told her name, Lucy Nickel. And so she, called it up on her computer and she said, oh yeah, she passed away in, 1985. And this is where she's buried at, and we just, it was between Springfield and Columbus, but it was closer to Columbus. So, and she, the lady at the funeral home, she told me, where it's at, what the name of the cemetery was, and everything. And so I, on my way home back to Worcester, you know, um, I had stopped at, when I found out where the cemetery was, I went and I found it, and I went into the office there at the cemetery, and I told him, I says, my great great grandma passed away, or great grandma. It wasn't great great, it was great grandma. That when her name was Lucy Nickel, and she's buried here somewhere, and I don't know where. And she passed away in 1985, and so they called it up on their computer, and they said, oh yeah, she's not very far from where the marker and everything wasn't very far from the office there at the cemetery. So the lady walked me out to where the marker was and everything, and so when I don't go there every time I'm down in Springfield or whatever, but there's been times that I will stop by there and stuff, and that's another one that I usually put flowers on when I do go there, but I don't go there every time I go to Springfield or Xenia. But when I do, I stop by and I put flowers on her grave. But but yeah, she passed away in 1985, and that was just natural causes. She just died of old age. So, huh? Pardon? I can't hear what you're saying, hon. Oh, it was just natural causes. Just she just passed away of old age. She was like in her 90s. So just natural causes. I mean, she was at a nursing home when she passed away, but it was just, she didn't die of, like cancer or any kind of illness. It was just natural. She just passed away of old age. You know, how old was she? Well, all I know is that she was in her 90s. I can't remember her exact age because I didn't see her that often when she was alive. I knew who she was, but matter of fact, some of the pictures I sent to you, she's in some of the pictures. And so, but, so right now, my family here, all I have left is my sister. Yeah, my brother in Indiana, that passed away, his wife is my sister-in-law because, is married to my brother. So, but it's not blood relative. It was, because she was married to well, Larry was my half brother. Ken was Ken was the only full brother I had. Sharon, my sister's half sister. The two Larrys, one in Ohio and one in Indiana, they were full brothers to each other because they had the same mom and dad. But all four of us boys, the three are gone plus me, we all had the same mom. So Ken, was Ken Marshall, so he was a full brother. We had the same mom and same dad. But the two Larrys, we had the same mom, but they had different dads. So they're half brothers. They were half brothers, just like Sharon's a half sister, because we had the same dad. Because my dad was also her dad, but her mom was, you know, somebody else. Her name was Ruth, but so she was just a half sister to me because it was the same dad. Well, as far as anybody beyond my great grandma Lucy Nickel, I have no idea who anybody is. I had never met anybody. It was never brought up in any conversations between mom and me or grandma and me. Other than Lucy Nickel, my great grandma, I knew nobody else beyond that. Like great great or great 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 or you know, don't know none of that. Hit family history. Husband of what? I have no idea. My mom, my grandma was my mom's mom, but my grandpa was not her dad. And as far as Lucy Nickel, my great grandma, who her mom was, I have no idea. Now, see, my mom and grandma, they used to live in Worcester. When my mom was in elementary school, they lived here in Worcester. And when my mom was in elementary, that was years before I was born. But my mom went to a Catholic school here in Worcester. And at the time, my grandma was married to an Italian guy that lived here because there's a section of Worcester that they call Little Italy, and his name was Dominic Carpelli. And if that ain't Irish, I don't know what is. Dominic Carpelli is definitely an Irish name, Irish or Italian or whatever. But grandma was married to him when mom and grandma lived in Worcester. But that was way back when mom was in elementary school, going to a Catholic school, here in town. My what? Well, my when my dad, I I really didn't know my dad. I told you this before. You know, from the time I was just so high until he passed away in 1980, I only saw him twice, and that was that was the first time, huh? I have no idea who my great grandma Lucy Nickel. I have no idea who she was married to. Don't don't know anything about that. I mean, and, and her, my great grandma Lucy Nickel. Anything beyond that, I know nothing about anything about any family members beyond her. That that was older than her and stuff. So my great grandmother was her name was Lucy Nickel, Mickle. But who her husband was, I don't know. And she wasn't. She was not my grandma. My mom's mom. Lucy Nickel was not her mom. So but we just referred to her as great grandma Lucy. But how that started, I don't know. But that's just how we referred to her, was great grandma Lucy. But I know that she was not my grandma's mom. How that, how she was related, to, the families and stuff, I don't know. I have no idea, hon. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, I remember a lot of stuff. I remember when my mom left me and that me and Ken at that children's home in Springfield when we were in like kindergarten, first grade. I remember that because that was very, traumatic for me and Ken because the guy she was involved with at the time, um, he was going to go to California and she wanted to be with him, but she didn't want to drag me and Ken along as like excess baggage. So that's why she left us in that children's home in Springfield so that she could follow this guy to California. So, but yet that guy, she was married to him twice. Same guy. First time she was married to him, he was so abusive to her. He beat her. He drank all the time. I mean, he had a job, but he drank all the time when he wasn't working. He he used to beat on her all the time. But then, they got a divorce, but then they eventually got back together, got married again. He was a totally different person. It was like you turning your light switch on and off, like from daytime, lighting up a room